You remember the movie line exactly. Luke, I am your father. You heard it. You said it. You joked about it with friends. But now somehow, it never existed. You scroll through videos. You watch the clip. You hear, no, I am your father. And suddenly the world wobbles. The floor of your certainty cracks. If something so vivid, so sure can be false, what else have you remembered wrong? What else have you built your life upon that never really happened? Maybe it's not about movie quotes. Maybe it's that feeling you get when you revisit an old neighborhood and the cafe you were certain existed there is gone. Or the family memory you could swear was real is gently corrected by someone else. You laugh it off. That's not how I remember it. But something deeper stirs. A quiet anxiety that your mind may be less of a camera and more of a painter, less a recorder and more a storyteller. Memory was supposed to anchor you, define you. But what if memory lies? What if entire parts of who you are were shaped by things that never happened? Or worse, things that did, but in a timeline no longer accessible to you? That's what we're exploring tonight. The fragile mystery of memory. The Mandela Effect. The soft machinery of false recall. And that quiet, eerie truth behind it all. Your mind may be keeping secrets. Even from you. Like plus subscribe if this feels like home. And tell me what's the memory that still haunts you, even if no one else remembers it. There's a moment, quiet, mundane, unremarkable on the surface, when something inside you slips. You're watching a video, scrolling past an image, or maybe listening to someone recount an event from years ago. It doesn't seem important at first, but then it hits you that's not how you remember it. The logo looks wrong. The line in the movie feels off. The childhood memory that you were so sure happened a certain way is told differently by someone else. You pause. You rewind. You try to align what you're seeing now with the archive you've kept inside for years. But they don't match, not even close. You laugh at first, a little unsure. You check again. And that's when the fracture begins. Not loud or dramatic, just a small silent split in the surface of your trust in the world. You had a clear picture in your mind. It felt real. You didn't question it until now. Some people experience this as curiosity. Others feel a kind of grief. A sense of being betrayed, not by someone, but by your own mind. That line you quoted for years. It was never said. That cereal brand you grew up eating. Spelled differently. That event you swear was part of your past. No one else remembers it. They smile politely. You probably misremembered. But you didn't. You know you didn't. You remember how it felt. And that's the strange thing. Memory isn't just visual. It's emotional, textured. The memory of your grandmother's voice isn't just the pitch, it's the warmth it carried. The memory of that summer in the old house isn't just where the furniture was. It's how the light filtered through the dusty air. Memory doesn't just recall data. It brings back the feeling of being there. And so when the world tells you your memory is wrong, it feels like reality itself is shifting beneath your feet. They call it the Mandela Effect, when large groups of people remember something one way only to find it never happened. People remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, but he didn't. They remember Berenstein Bears, not Berenstain. They remember a movie called Shazam starring Sinbad. It doesn't exist. These aren't just typos or trivia mistakes. These are memories, vivid, emotional, shared. And they raise a strange question: if so many people remember the same wrong thing, is it really wrong? Or are we touching something deeper, some crack in the simulation, some fragment of a forgotten dream? That's what makes this so eerie. Memory isn't supposed to be debatable. It's supposed to be yours. And yet here you are, standing in front of a cracked mirror, and the reflection doesn't quite match who you thought you were. You tilt your head. The face stares back familiar, but off, slightly out of alignment, as if someone rearranged your memories while you slept. And the more you think about it, the more you wonder how many other moments in your life were built on shaky ground. How many truths did you internalize, only to find later they weren't facts, just fragments? This isn't just a trick of the brain, it's a spiritual rift, a soft unraveling of the thread that ties you to time. We are taught to believe memory is the backbone of identity. But what happens when the backbone bends? When the timeline glitches? When the people around you don't recall the things that shaped you most, it's disorienting. Like stepping into a familiar room only to find the furniture rearranged. Nothing is missing, but everything feels slightly wrong. And then comes the quiet fear, not that you're wrong, but that you're alone in your version of the past. That maybe your mind constructed a reality no one else can enter. A private museum of events that didn't happen. And yet they did. To you. They left marks. They formed patterns. They shaped how you trust, how you love, how you grieve. So how can they not be real? You begin to realize this fracture isn't just about pop culture trivia or misheard quotes. It's about the architecture of self, about the delicate structure of identity and the way memory props it up like scaffolding around a half-built house. You thought you were on solid ground, but now it feels more like a floating island adrift slightly untethered from the mainland of shared experience. A question rises slowly. What if the memory feels more real than the fact? What if the feeling of a moment is more important than the literal details? What if your mind has been building a truth, not from what was, but from what you needed it to be? The cracked mirror reflects a different you now. Not broken, just reassembled, rearranged. A collage of real and imagined moments. Some pieces fit. Others are stretched, recolored, softened by time. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not meant to remember perfectly. Maybe we're meant to remember meaningfully. But still, the fracture remains. And you wonder what other parts of you are built on dreams. You were taught to think of memory like a file cabinet, neat labeled folders arranged chronologically just waiting to be retrieved when needed. But it isn't like that at all. Memory isn't a static archive. It's a living, breathing story that rewrites itself every time you revisit it. Each time you remember something, you're not pulling out a preserved moment. You're reimagining it, rebuilding it, retelling it with whatever tools your current self has. And that means memory is less about what happened and more about what you believe happened, or what you needed to believe. That's why it feels so slippery, so hard to trust, because deep down, your memories are not time capsules. They're stories told by a narrator who keeps evolving, and sometimes that narrator doesn't want you to know everything. You recall a childhood moment, the warm scent of pancakes, the sound of your father's laugh, the rain tapping on the window while your dog curled up beside you. It feels sacred, untouched. But then someone reminds you, your father wasn't there that day. He was away. And it wasn't pancakes, it was cereal. And suddenly the picture wobbles, the details blur, but the feeling is still real. That's the part that stays, because memory isn't about perfect recall, it's about emotional coherence. Your mind stores what felt true, what helped you survive, what gave your life meaning. And sometimes that means altering the details, not to deceive, but to protect. Psychologists call this reconstructive memory, the idea that each recollection is a reconstruction, not a replay. And it's affected by what came before, what came after, and who you are right now. It's a patchwork, like a quilt, stitched from scraps of fabric, some new, some faded, some borrowed from other people's stories altogether. That's why two people can live through the same event and walk away with wildly different memories of it. Not because one is lying, but because each mind interprets meaning in its own way. Each person's inner narrator edits for tone, for emotion, for survival. Think of your memory like a tape recorder left out too long in the sun. The ribbon warps, stretches. Some parts fade, others loop. Eventually, the voice on the tape sounds a little different. You rewind, but it never plays quite the same way twice. That's not a glitch. That's the nature of remembering. And once you realize this, really feel it, you begin to question every certainty you've ever had. The first time you felt loved. The time you knew someone betrayed you. The thing you were so sure you said, or didn't. You wonder how many of these moments were real. How many were stories that became real enough? But here's the deeper layer: your brain needs these stories. Without them, identity collapses. You are the sum of what you've experienced, or at least what you think you've experienced. Take away the memories and the scaffolding falls. So the mind does what it must. It fills in the gaps. It smooths the edges. It lies sometimes, but always for a reason. Always to protect the sense of continuity, the illusion that you've been the same person all along, that your life makes sense even when it doesn't. And in that way, memory becomes less of a record and more of a myth. A personal mythology woven from half-truths, gut feelings, misheard words, and dreams mistaken for fact. But here's where it gets tricky. If memory is a story, who's the author? Is it your ego, your inner child, your trauma, your future self trying to make sense of the past? Maybe it's all of them. Maybe memory is a collaboration between the parts of you that needed meaning and the parts that couldn't handle the truth. And maybe that's okay. Maybe not every misremembered detail is a flaw. Maybe it's a clue, a symbol, a mirror. And yet the question lingers, how many parts of your life are fiction you believed long enough to become true? That moment of connection you still cherish, did it happen? Like you remember? Or did you rewrite it because you needed to feel loved? That time you were certain someone betrayed you? Was it really them? Or was your fear filling in the silence? That failure you carry? Was it truly a failure? Or just a lesson? The story hasn't finished telling. You look back now and the past stretches like a road behind you, not straight, not fixed, but winding, reshaped each time you glance over your shoulder. Some landmarks have shifted, others have vanished, and some were never there to begin with, but still you walk, still you believe, because memory in the end isn't about accuracy, it's about narrative. It's the story that helps you wake up in the morning and say, this is who I am. So maybe the goal isn't to have perfect memory. Maybe the goal is to listen to your story with curiosity, not certainty. To notice where the voice shakes, where the details don't add up. Not to punish yourself, but to understand the deeper need beneath the misremembering. Was it safety? Belonging, control, forgiveness? The tape unspools across the floor, curling slowly in the dim light. You don't rush to rewind it. You just watch. Let it rest. Let the story breathe. And in the quiet, you ask yourself softly, what truth have I been telling myself, not because it happened, but because I needed it to? There's a strange kind of comfort in thinking your memory betrayed you, a private misfire, a personal lapse. But what happens when thousands, even millions of people remember the same wrong thing? When you're not alone in your mistake, but surrounded by others who swear they saw it too? That's the eerie territory of the Mandela Effect. A moment not just of forgetfulness, but of collective distortion. A shared memory that didn't happen. A parallel version of reality that feels true even when the facts say otherwise. It began with a simple contradiction. Some people clearly remembered Nelson Mandela dying in a South African prison during the 1980s. They recalled news footage, funerals, mourning crowds. But Mandela didn't die then. He was released in 1990, lived for decades after. And yet thousands of people felt sure, not just vague impressions, but vivid, emotionally detailed recollections. That unsettling discrepancy gave birth to the name the Mandela Effect, a phrase to capture that uncanny moment when reality disagrees with memory, not just individually, but collectively. And it didn't stop there. The Berenstain Bears became the Berenstain Bears. Curious George never had a tail. Mirror, mirror on the wall is apparently magic mirror on the wall. Even the Monopoly man, the dapper figure you remember with a monocle, never wore one. These aren't just forgotten footnotes. They're deeply felt truths, anchors of childhood, fragments of pop culture, small but emotionally resonant moments that feel off. And yet there they are. Different, undeniable, documented. So the question becomes, how why? How can so many people remember the same false thing? Are we all misremembering in the exact same way? Or is something else happening, something stranger? One explanation is cognitive. It's the way the brain searches for patterns, the way similar sounds or associations blur over time. Berenstain feels right because names ending in Stein are familiar. The brain smooths it over. Memory errors multiplied by millions of people exposed to the same influences produce the illusion of shared memory. But even knowing this, even accepting the neuroscience, doesn't make the feeling go away. Because it feels real. It feels like the past itself changed. And that's the crack where possibility seeps in. What if these aren't just memory glitches? What if they're glimpses? Glitches in a deeper system. Evidence perhaps that our reality is more fluid than we think. The Mandela Effect has become a kind of spiritual Rorschach test. Some see multiverse theory alternate timelines bleeding into each other. Some see a simulation, a matrix-style program correcting inconsistencies. Some interpret it metaphysically, a mass shift in human consciousness, a jump between dimensions. And whether or not you believe those theories, the point remains, something about the Mandela Effect touches a deep symbolic nerve. Because if something small can be remembered differently, what about something big? What about your relationships? Your origin story, your beliefs? What else might be out of sync, not just in your memory, but in reality itself? That's where the fear creeps in, and also the wonder. There's a paradox at the center of the Mandela Effect. If enough people remember the same false thing, does that make it real in some way? Not in the literal sense, but in the emotional one. If millions of people felt comforted by a fictional movie that never existed, didn't it leave an impact? If you cried at a scene that was never filmed, does that grief matter less? Reality, after all, is not just about what's observable, it's about what's felt, and feelings are harder to fact-check. You begin to see the symbolic shape of this glitch. Imagine a news broadcast frozen mid-frame. The anchor's face blurred the text at the bottom, glitching between timelines. Is it a broken feed? Or a window into something we're not supposed to notice? The Mandela Effect feels like that, a broadcast from the in-between. A place where the past is negotiable. Where truth flickers. And maybe deep down that's what scares us most, not that we're wrong, but that the world isn't as solid as we hoped. That what we call the past is a moving target. That memory is not the anchor we want, but a tide that pulls differently depending on where you stand. What then becomes of certainty? You might ask, if I feel sure, but the evidence says otherwise, who do I believe? The facts, or the version of myself that remembers? And what if both are true in their own way? What if memory is less about accuracy and more about alignment? Not with history, but with identity. The Mandela Effect shows us something quietly revolutionary. That shared memory can shape reality not in the factual sense, but in the emotional and psychological one. That the collective imagination is powerful. That when enough minds believe in something even wrongly, it becomes real enough to influence thought culture, even history. Myths are built this way. Religions, nations, personal narratives, not always factually correct but deeply meaningful, believed into being. So perhaps this is the real question. Is it better to remember wrongly than not at all? Would you rather carry a beautiful lie or face a disorienting truth? When your memory clashes with consensus, do you correct yourself or honor your version? The Mandela Effect is more than a glitch. It's a mirror. One that doesn't show you the past but your relationship to it. A flicker in the tape. A soft, low hum beneath the surface of what you thought was solid. And maybe, just maybe, it's an invitation to look closer. There are memories you hold not because they happened, but because you needed them to. And sometimes those needs began when you were too young to articulate them, too small to argue with the world, too scared to face a truth that might have broken you. So instead, the inner child did what it does best, imagined a version of reality it could survive. Not a lie exactly, more like a soft blanket over a cold floor. A safe room built inside the mind, where the pain was dulled, the faces were kinder, and the ending wasn't so lonely. You look back now and wonder which memories were real, and which were self-protection disguised as story. Psychologically, this process has a name. It's a kind of unconscious fabrication. Your young mind, in the absence of full understanding or emotional safety, creates narratives to make sense of what it cannot bear. You remember the hug that never came, the apology that was never said, the birthday when they sang to you but really the room was quiet. And yet, in your memory, it's all there. The cake, the candles, the smile on a parent's face who in truth may have been absent. And here's the strange part, those imagined details still shaped you, still comforted you, still became part of the architecture of your identity. That's the quiet power of the inner child, not just to endure the world, but to rewrite it, Carl Jung spoke of the child archetype as both a symbol of potential and vulnerability. The child within you is not just a remnant of the past, it's an active storyteller, one that never stopped trying to make the world feel safe enough to rest in. Even now, as an adult, you may find yourself remembering things that bring a sense of comfort or justice, only to realize they might never have happened. And maybe that realization hurts. But maybe it also explains something why certain memories feel too perfect, too cinematic, too symbolic. Because they're inner myths, emotional bandages, evidence of the stories your younger self needed in order to make it through. Imagine a child drawing a picture of their family, but some faces are left blank, or drawn with exaggerated smiles that didn't match real expressions. This isn't manipulation, it's protection. It's the mind's way of saying, if I can't change the past, I'll soften it. I'll make the absence look like presence. I'll fill in the silence with imagined love. And those drawings stay with you, etched in the gallery of your memory. You walk through it without even knowing, seeing portraits of love that may have been wished for more than lived. But here's the paradox: even fabricated memories can carry truth. Not factual truth, but emotional truth. The imagined hug still speaks to a real need. The false memory of being comforted still reflects the ache for belonging. In that way, the memory is real, not in what it depicts, but in what it reveals. That's the layer most people miss. False memories aren't just cognitive errors, they're emotional artifacts, messages left behind by your younger self, encoded in narrative form. And those messages whisper, I needed to feel safe. I needed to feel seen. So what do you do with that? Do you correct the memory, replace it with the real version? Or do you listen to what the inner child was trying to say? There's no clear answer, but maybe the invitation is to stop judging your memory by whether it's accurate, and start listening to whether it's honest. Honest about your needs, your fears, your longings. Because sometimes the truest thing you can remember is what you were missing. There's also another side, the shadow. Not all fabrications are soft. Some are sharp. Some come from places of fear, not hope. The inner child might invent danger to explain chaos, might fabricate blame to make sense of abandonment. You may remember someone hurting you when really they just weren't there. Or remember rejection in a moment where silence was misread. These aren't lies, they're emotional interpretations, and they still matter. They still shape how you relate, how you protect yourself, how you expect the world to behave. And yet when those memories are challenged, when someone gently says, "That's not how it happened," it can feel like a violation, not just of fact, but of self. Because they're not just questioning a memory, they're questioning the you that was built from it. And that's painful, like being told the home you grew up in was never really yours. Even if it was imagined, it still felt like shelter. So the question becomes, did your mind protect you by lying? And if so, is that something to mourn or to thank? Maybe both. Maybe the healing begins, not with correcting the story, but with honoring why it was told. You picture that child, again drawing, coloring, inventing, not to deceive but to survive. And suddenly the memory doesn't feel fake anymore. It feels like a message in a bottle. A dream trying to tell you what you once needed. The fabricated moments were never about fact. They were about feeling, and maybe, just maybe, they still deserve a place in the museum of your life. Not under the label truth, but under something softer. This helped me. There's a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when the mind doesn't know what happened, and fills in the gap anyway. A sliver of time unaccounted for. A detail forgotten. A silence too wide to ignore. And instead of sitting in that uncertainty, your mind constructs a story. Seamless, convincing, complete. This is called confabulation. It sounds like deception, but it isn't. You're not lying. You're not pretending. You truly believe the version you've assembled. Because to the brain, coherence matters more than accuracy. The gaps must be closed. The silence must be spoken over. And so it builds. Confabulation isn't rare. It doesn't just happen to people with memory loss or brain injury. It happens to all of us, every day, in the way we remember a conversation slightly differently than it happened, in how we recount our own childhood with more clarity than we ever actually had at the time. In the way we tell our origin story when we started changing, growing, breaking, becoming, and we smooth the messy parts so they make more sense. We edit, we rearrange. Not to deceive others, but to survive ourselves. This is especially true with trauma. Gabor Maté has written about the mind's ability to shield us from the unbearable, not by erasing the pain, but by reshaping its meaning. A child who experiences neglect might not remember being neglected. Instead, they may remember being difficult. Too much, not enough. Because it's safer to blame the self than to face the terrifying idea that the people who were supposed to protect you didn't. So the mind fills the gap with guilt, with shame, with invented sins. Not because it's malicious, but because it's trying to restore order where there was none. You picture it like this: pages torn from a journal. Days or moments lost to fog. The story has holes. And so your mind, like a desperate editor, tapes in new pages, rewrites entire chapters, reorders the timeline, adds characters, softens endings. Sometimes it fabricates joy to cover despair. Sometimes it invents betrayal to explain a love that ended without closure. These aren't lies. They're scaffolding. The structure you needed to keep standing. And without it, the whole narrative might have collapsed. But this brings up a haunting question. What if the things you remember with certainty never happened at all? What if your mind, with the best intentions, told you a story, and you've lived by it ever since? The friend you stopped talking to, convinced they turned cold. The teacher who humiliated you, though perhaps it was just an awkward moment. The feeling of being excluded, even if no one truly meant harm. These memories may be fragments stitched together with emotion more than evidence. There's a symbol here, a book repaired with mismatched tape. Some pages out of order, some illustrations redrawn. It's still your book. It's still your story. But parts of it may have been built by a younger version of you or a more frightened one. A self that couldn't bear the truth, so it made something close enough. And sometimes close enough is all we can handle. The danger, of course, is when we mistake the repair for the original, when we fight to defend a memory not because it's true, but because it holds our identity together. That's the subtle trap. The confabulated memory becomes a cornerstone, and if someone questions it, we feel threatened. Not just factually, but existentially. If this memory isn't real, then who am I? What else have I misunderstood? But maybe this doesn't need to be a crisis. Maybe it's an invitation. A chance to look at the patched pages of our story and say, yes, this was added later. Yes, this was rearranged. And yes, it still matters. Because the mind doesn't fabricate at random. It chooses what to fill in based on emotion, on longing, on wounds still unhealed. In that way, confabulation becomes less about error and more about need, less about falsehood and more about survival. Think of the way dreams work. How they stitch together the day's fragments, thoughts, fears, bits of overheard dialogue into a narrative that makes no literal sense, but feels emotionally accurate. That's how memory can work too, especially when the truth is too much. The mind dreams on your behalf, awake. So the next time you remember something with vivid clarity and someone tells you it didn't happen that way, pause. Not to argue, not to retreat, but to wonder, what gap was I trying to fill? What silence was I afraid to leave untouched? And if you find a memory that feels suspiciously complete, no rough edges, no ambiguity, maybe that's the one to sit with longer. To gently ask, who wrote this part? Was it my adult self? Or the child who needed closure? There's no shame in discovering that parts of your story were confabulated. There's grace in it even. The grace of a mind doing what it could with what it had to keep you whole. And maybe the healing begins not by tearing those pages out, but by acknowledging them, holding them, letting them speak even if they aren't historically true, because they're still emotionally true. And emotional truth is what drives us, shapes us, and paradoxically helps us find our way back to something real. There's a strange thing that happens when someone insists you remember something a certain way. Maybe it's a family member telling you that you cried during that childhood recital even though you remember being fine. Maybe it's a friend who swears you were there at that party on that trip, and the more they say it, the harder it becomes to trust your own mind. The memory begins to feel soft around the edges, like a photograph left out in the sun. You start to question yourself. Not just the moment, but your reliability, your truth, and this is where suggestion takes hold. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. In the 1970s, Elizabeth Loftus conducted now famous experiments showing just how easy it is to implant false memories in people, not through hypnosis or trauma, but through the quiet power of suggestion. In one study, participants watched videos of a car crash. Later, they were asked questions with subtle variations. How fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Versus how fast were they going when they smashed? That one word, smashed, changed everything. Those who heard it reported the cars going faster, imagined broken glass that didn't exist, remembered the scene as more violent. Just from a single word. That's the fragility of memory. Not because you're weak or gullible, but because memory is deeply social. It doesn't live in a vacuum. It evolves in conversation, in context, in the stories we tell each other over and over. The brain wants to make sense of things. It wants harmony. So when new information comes in, especially from someone you trust, it begins to shift the narrative subtly, invisibly, like water absorbing the shape of whatever container it's poured into. Now imagine that process not in a lab, but in your life. A parent rewriting a family event to protect themselves. A partner insisting you're overreacting even when you're sure you remember what was said. A crowd chanting the same false version of a moment until it becomes the only version anyone acknowledges. That's not just misremembering. That's psychological suggestion embedded in power. A gentle form of gaslighting, sometimes unintentional but no less disorienting. And what's more unsettling is this: the brain doesn't just absorb these suggestions. It fuses them. The new memory gets folded into the old one. And soon you can't tell where your truth ends and theirs begins. You may even begin to defend the implanted version. You may believe it was yours all along. Imagine a courtroom sketch artist asked to draw a face based only on testimony. Over time, the drawing changes, details shift, the lines blur, but the picture still carries authority, still gets treated like evidence. That's your memory under the influence of suggestion. Still yours, still emotional, but quietly altered. And the question becomes, how do you know which version is true if someone else remembers it differently, and they're sure, are they wrong? Or are you? It's a lonely place doubting your own recall. But what's even lonelier is realizing how easily others can shape it. That your memories are vulnerable to tone, to repetition, to confidence. And this realization can lead to a quiet crisis. If I can't trust my own memory, how do I trust myself? The answer perhaps isn't to aim for perfect recall, but to understand how memory actually works. To stop thinking of it as a locked vault and start seeing it as a collaborative space. A gallery curated by multiple influences, experience, emotion, suggestion, repetition, authority, even hope. And when you view memory that way, the distortions don't look like failures. They look like conversations. Ongoing, messy, sometimes misguided, but still human. But suggestion doesn't always come from people. Sometimes it comes from culture, from the way history is told, from media, from the endless retelling of events through the lens of whoever gets to speak loudest. You grow up hearing one version of a national tragedy, one version of what your ancestors endured, one version of what your identity means, and over time that version feels like memory, even if it's only narrative, even if it's been edited for effect, and still it shapes you. So here's the paradox: if everyone around you remembers it the same way, does it become true even if it wasn't? And more painfully, if you're the only one who remembers it differently, does that make you wrong? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions worth asking, because they point to the deeper function of memory, not as a keeper of facts, but as a mirror of meaning. Your memory reflects what mattered, what hurt, what helped you feel like you had a place in the world. Suggestion can alter the details, but rarely the feeling. If you felt abandoned, you carry that, even if others insist it didn't happen that way. If you felt seen, loved, dismissed, ignored, that's the emotional core. And it survives the edits. So maybe the task isn't to defend your memory like evidence in a trial. Maybe it's to hold it like a story told around a fire, changing slightly each time depending on who's listening. But still yours, still sacred, still true, in the ways that matter most. You step into a room you've never seen before, and suddenly a wave of eerie familiarity washes over you. The color of the walls, the creak in the floorboard, the way the light hits the edge of a bookshelf. You know you've been here, except you haven't, not in this lifetime, not in any verifiable sense. That strange, slow ripple through your awareness, a whisper that says, this has happened before. It doesn't ask for logic. It just is. That's déjà vu. A crack in the present where the past shouldn't fit, but somehow does. Déjà vu is one of those mental glitches we casually brush off, yet secretly fear. It feels mystical, like you've briefly stepped outside the boundaries of time. But what is it really? Science has tried to explain it as a momentary misfiring between short-term and long-term memory, or as a processing delay between the brain's perception channels. But even those explanations fall short of capturing the surreal emotional texture of the experience. Because déjà vu doesn't just say you've seen this before. It says you were supposed to be here. It feels different from a false memory. Déjà vu doesn't carry a full narrative. It doesn't have context. It doesn't unfold as a memory does. It arrives suddenly without warning, like a déjà trap door opening beneath your feet. And in that suspended moment, the laws of time and logic feel negotiable. What's even stranger is how you know it won't last. The feeling fades as quickly as it comes. And when it does, you're left with a sense of absence, like waking from a dream you almost remembered. False memories, on the other hand, don't come and go. They live in you. They embed themselves in your timeline. You might remember the layout of a childhood home that never existed. You might swear you owned a certain toy, wore a certain shirt, said a certain thing. The memory contains emotional color, emotional weight, but no factual foundation. Yet it feels just as true, sometimes more true, than the things that actually happened. And unlike déjà vu, which feels like time bleeding forward, false memories feel like time restitched from the past. There's a subtle but meaningful distinction here. Déjà vu is a question that comes from the present. False memory is a belief that builds the past. One invites mystery. The other constructs meaning. And yet both reveal the same strange truth: the brain is not a passive recorder. It's a storyteller, a pattern maker, a weaver of moments into a narrative that feels coherent even when it isn't linear, even when it isn't true. So you find yourself wondering, if I feel I've been here before, does it matter whether I have? And what does being even mean in a universe where time may not be as rigid as we pretend? Could déjà vu be a flash from another version of you? A memory not from this life, but from a parallel one. A dream echo, a signal from the unconscious. Jung might call it a symbolic return, an archetypal place within your psyche that your outer world just happened to mirror. A psychic alignment between the inner and outer worlds briefly revealed. Adler might suggest it reflects your life's purpose, subtly guiding your path, and when you feel déjà vu, you're stepping into alignment even for a flicker. Gabor Maté might frame it as a residue of unresolved trauma, where your mind momentarily overlaps past danger with present safety, trying to integrate what was never processed. There's a symbol here, a clock with 2-minute hands rotating in opposite directions. One moves forward through time, the other backward, and every so often they meet. That meeting point is déjà vu, a psychic collision. A reminder that time might not be what we think it is. That memory and perhaps even identity can loop. But what if you confuse the two? What if a false memory feels like déjà vu in reverse? Not I've been here before, but I used to be someone else, a version of you who chose a different path. A life that branched away from this one. And somehow your mind remembers a piece of it. Not enough to rebuild the whole, just enough to ache for what might have been. You recall a conversation that never happened, a relationship that ended differently, a decision you thought you made, but never did. Is that memory false or simply borrowed? These are the soft places where logic can't reach, where memory becomes mist. And maybe that's the real question. Do we need memory to be accurate, or just meaningful? Is it more important that a moment happened, or that it mattered? You think back on all the times you trusted your memory, only to find the evidence didn't align. And you remember all the times you doubted your own intuition, only to realize later that you knew something before it was spoken. Maybe memory isn't just about time. Maybe it's about truth, emotional truth, symbolic truth. The kind that doesn't need proof to exist. So when déjà vu visits you again, that flicker, that shiver, don't chase it away. Don't demand it explain itself. Just pause, listen. Ask gently, what are you trying to show me? And when a false memory rises vivid and persistent, don't rush to correct it. Instead ask, why did I need this to be true? What is this story trying to protect? Because in the end, both are reminders that the mind is not bound by time. That memory is more than record, it is ritual. A way the soul traces its own steps even when the footprints don't show. You believe you are who you remember being. That's the simplest way to define identity. A timeline of moments strung together like beads: the childhood bike crash, the first kiss, the argument that ended everything, the moment you stood up for yourself. All of it arranged in your mind like a necklace of selfhood. You wear it unconsciously. It tells you who you are. But what if some of those beads are false? What if others are missing entirely? What if the string is frayed or rearranged? If your memory is flawed, then who are you really? This is the quiet trap of memory, that it convinces you your identity is solid, that it tells a clean, linear story of growth, failure, transformation. But identity, like memory, is a construction, not a constant. You weren't born knowing who you are. You assemble that knowledge over time, largely by recalling what you've done, what you felt, and what others reflected back to you. But if those reflections were distorted, or those moments imagined or misremembered, then your self-concept is shaped by fiction as much as fact. And that fiction becomes your truth. Alfred Adler believed that humans act according to perceived memories, not objective ones. That we make decisions, choose careers, fall in love, push people away based not on what happened, but on the meaning we assigned to what we think happened. You may believe you've always been too sensitive because you remember being teased for crying in second grade. But what if no one actually teased you? What if that moment was silence, not ridicule, and your mind seeking explanation filled in the blank with blame? That memory still formed a piece of your identity, still sculpted how you protect yourself, even if it wasn't true. And that's the paradox. You are shaped by things that may never have happened. But because you believe they did, they carry power. They build habits, fears, defense mechanisms. You become the child who felt invisible, the teenager who believed love had to be earned, the adult who trusts only when it's proven twice. Each piece built on a memory, which may itself be made of longing, not fact. There's a symbol here, a name tag freshly printed, but as you try to read it, the ink begins to fade. Each time you try to recall who you are, what made you you, the letters blur just slightly. You can't quite hold the image still. That's identity built on memory, always shifting, always vulnerable to suggestion, erosion, reinvention. Sometimes this is liberating. If memory is fragile, then so is the identity built upon it, which means you're not trapped. You can change. You can release the stories that no longer serve you. But it's also terrifying. Because if you peel away the stories, what's left? If you can't trust your memories, can you trust yourself? And what about the memories you don't have? The ones that never formed or were erased by trauma, time, or denial? The early years you can't remember, do they still shape you? Absolutely. Because absence is just as formative as presence. You may not remember being neglected, but the identity you built around hyper-independence may be its echo. You may not recall being criticized, but the perfectionism you carry might be a scar from words you can no longer hear. You were still shaped, even in silence. So the question rises, how much of you is who you remember being? And how much is who you had to become, based on what your memory told you? You may believe you're someone who doesn't trust easily, but what if that's just an inherited narrative, not from your own experience, but from a memory implanted by suggestion or even culture? You may believe you're not good at love, not because of failure, but because of a false memory of rejection that never truly happened or happened differently than you remember. This is the identity trap. You defend the person you think you are. You build a fortress around it. But if the foundation is fog, what are you really protecting? It's a quiet sort of tragedy when you think about it, that you may have lived entire years as someone defined by misremembered pain, that you may have denied yourself joy or intimacy or risk because of a story your brain told you, one that you never questioned, because it felt real. And feelings, after all, are convincing. But maybe this isn't tragedy. Maybe it's threshold, a place to pause and ask if I am not the sum of my remembered past. What else might I be? What new identity could emerge not from what you were told or what you believed, but from what you choose now? Because the self is not fixed. Memory may be flawed, but so is the idea that you are permanently bound to who you once were. You can change, not by erasing memory, but by softening your grip on it. By seeing the story not as a verdict, but as a version. You close your eyes and feel the timeline unravel. Not break, just loosen. The milestones blur. The labels lift. And what remains isn't a perfect identity. It's an openness, a willingness to ask, who am I if I don't have to be who I remember and maybe? That's where the real self begins. Not all memories belong to you. Some were handed down, whispered over dinner tables, etched into textbooks, embroidered into flags. Some arrived before you were old enough to question, tucked inside fairy tales, family myths, national anthems. You absorbed them without knowing, and they began to shape you, not as personal recollection, but as inherited memory, collective dreams, cultural scripts, truths we call history, even when the facts shift, even when the details blur under scrutiny. These memories live in the bloodstream of identity not because we lived them, but because we agreed to believe them. You may remember your grandfather as a war hero, not because you saw it, but because it was told to you with pride. You may remember your country as a land of freedom, not because you experienced it that way, but because the stories repeated it like a song. You may remember your family as close-knit even though underneath there were fractures. These are not lies. They're lenses. Stories told so often they take on the weight of memory, and slowly they become part of the self. Philosophers have long argued that memory isn't just personal, it's political. What we choose to remember shapes what we believe is possible, and what we forget or rewrite becomes the hidden cost of collective comfort. Cultural false memories serve a purpose. They bind groups together. They create continuity. They offer identity at scale, but they also erase nuance, suppress contradiction, make it harder to see the gaps between reality and belief. Imagine a photo album left open on a table, page after page of smiling faces posed and perfect. No one is crying, no one is absent, no one is angry or afraid. It's a curated archive, not of what was, but of what should have been. And if you're born into that photo album, you inherit not just the images, but the pressure to match them. You grow up trying to live up to memories that never quite happened. This is how collective falsehoods live on, not through conspiracy, but through comfort, through the longing for a clean story, for a past that feels noble, purposeful, linear. It's easier to say our ancestors were brave than to hold the truth that they were also flawed. Easier to remember victory than to face the shadow of how it was won. So we polish the rough edges, we canonize the past, and the myth becomes memory. But what happens when the cracks show? When the version you were given doesn't fit your experience? When the stories of unity feel false because you felt alone? When the family mythology doesn't explain your pain? That's when the dissonance begins. A quiet splitting inside, because the memory you inherited no longer matches the truth you live, and to question it feels like betrayal. You may feel guilt for not remembering things the way others do, for seeing through the illusion, for pointing out that the emperor's crown was just a hat. But here's the paradox. What if the entire generation misremembers the same thing? Is it still false, or has it become true through belief? The human mind is deeply social. We remember what the group remembers. We forget what makes us feel separate. That's how collective memory functions, not as an archive, but as a mirror, reflecting who we think we are, who we want to be, and sometimes who we need to pretend we were. Even in personal circles this shows up. Families who rewrite the past to avoid conflict, who agree silently not to talk about what happened or to change the story until it no longer hurts. The brother who wasn't angry, just going through a phase. The mother who didn't ignore you, just had a lot on her plate. The night that was just a misunderstanding. And slowly the silence becomes the story. The absence becomes the memory. But your body remembers. Even if the facts don't line up. Even if the words have been rewritten. Gabor Maté reminds us the body keeps the score. The tension, the withdrawal, the sense that something never quite added up. These are memory's shadow forms, not narrative but sensation. Not visible but still shaping everything. So you begin to ask, what memories do I carry that never belonged to me? What scripts am I living out that were written before I had a choice? What truths have I been protecting not because I believe them, but because I didn't want to be the one who broke the spell? And perhaps the more radical question is, can I let go of the dream without losing the meaning? Can I honor where I came from even if the story was flawed, even if the myth was just that a myth? Because sometimes the most healing act isn't remembering differently. It's remembering honestly, saying, yes, that's what we believed, but now I see more. Not to condemn the past, but to liberate the future. The photo album remains on the table, pages gently turning. And now maybe you see it for what it is, not a record, but a ritual, a way of holding on to something fragile, a symbol of belonging. And you're allowed to step outside of it, to make your own page. Not perfect, not polished, but real. But sometimes it didn't happen. Not the way you remember it. Not at all. The person you recall comforting you never said those words. The moment you felt seen may have only lived in your imagination. The apology you remember holding onto that soft moment of reckoning might not have occurred in this timeline. And yet, the feeling remains. The warmth, the safety, the closure. It's still inside you. As real, if not more real, than events you can verify. And so you wonder if a memory is false, but the emotion is true. What does that make it? This is the strange terrain of emotional memory, where what mattered wasn't what happened, but what you felt happen. A dream, a wish, a longing so deep that your mind built a container for it. Not to deceive, not to escape, but to finally feel what it needed to feel. And when you trace it back, when you ask yourself whether that moment really occurred, there's a pause, an uncertainty. But the feeling, that part is unquestionable, and that's what stays. Memory isn't just cognitive. It's sensory, emotional, somatic. It's why you can't remember the date of a certain loss, but you feel your chest tighten every time that season returns. It's why you forget the exact words someone said, but remember the way they made you feel down to the silence that followed. Emotional truth outlasts factual truth. It lives in the body, in breath, in instinct. And sometimes when the facts aren't enough, your psyche creates a memory that carries the feeling you needed. A false memory, with a true heart. There's a symbol here, a shadow hugging someone who isn't there. A silhouette of warmth imprinted onto the psyche. No physical arms, no source. But the comfort is real. You felt it, you carried it, and in that way it became part of you. Not because it happened, but because it healed something that did. These moments are often dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. But what is imagination if not the soul's rehearsal space? A sacred ground where unmet needs are given shape, where the mind speaks what the world would not. When the world didn't offer safety, the dream did. When the apology never came, the false memory whispered, you were right, you were worthy, you didn't imagine the pain. And in that dream you exhaled, maybe for the first time in years. Some may say that's dangerous to believe in what didn't happen, but isn't it also dangerous to discard the truths? Your body knows simply because they don't match someone else's narrative. Emotional truth doesn't require witnesses. It requires acknowledgement. And even false memories, when born from longing, can reveal what's missing with stunning precision. Gabor Maté speaks often of how trauma lives not in the event but in the body's response, the loneliness, the suppression, the disconnection. Sometimes healing doesn't come from revisiting the facts. It comes from receiving what was never given, even if that giving takes place in imagination, in dream, in a memory that's half invented but wholly needed. You may remember someone forgiving you when they never did. You may recall a reconciliation that never actually occurred. And yet, it changed you. It softened something. It allowed you to stop bracing against shame. Does the absence of evidence make it less meaningful? Or take the opposite, you may have a false memory of being blamed, punished, abandoned. It didn't happen as your mind remembers. But the feeling, the fear, the loneliness, that part was true. The memory formed to hold the emotion, to name it. So even if the details are wrong, the wound is not. The wound never lies. So maybe that's the better question. What does this memory protect? Or what did it give me when nothing else could? And perhaps there's no need to choose between fact and feeling. Perhaps the invitation is to hold both. To say this may not have happened, but it helped me heal. or this was never said. But I needed to hear it. And in honoring that emotional necessity, you're not deluding yourself. You're dignifying the part of you that waited far too long to be seen. There's a kind of grace in that. To sit with a memory and say, I don't know if you're real, but I know why you're here. You're the voice I needed, the moment I never got, the comfort that never came from outside, so it rose from within. And maybe that's where memory becomes sacred. Not as a factual log, but as a psychic balm. Not always true in detail, but true in meaning. A soft internal truth wrapped in metaphor. And you are allowed to believe in the feeling, even if the facts blur. Because healing isn't about accuracy, it's about integration. And if a false memory helped you carry pain, or release it, or love yourself a little more, maybe it was never false at all. There's a moment, quiet, internal, almost invisible, when someone tells you your memory is wrong. Not just mistaken, but fundamentally flawed. That's not how it happened. You're overreacting. You always twist things. The words are delivered casually, maybe even gently. But something in you recoils. Because this isn't about a small misremembering. It's about your reality being slowly rewritten in front of you. And as they deny your memory, you begin to doubt not just the past, but yourself. This is the heart of gaslighting, the psychological manipulation that makes you question the accuracy of your own perceptions. It doesn't start loud. It starts with suggestions, with omissions, with reinterpretations of events that were once clear in your mind. Over time, the erosion begins. You stop trusting your memory. You ask others to confirm things you used to know. You begin to apologize for what you felt. And slowly, reality becomes negotiable. Gaslighting isn't just about lying. It's about control. The abuser doesn't need you to forget everything. They just need you to question enough to defer to their version, to make you seek their confirmation, to depend on their account of events. And when that happens, memory becomes a battlefield. Every moment is up for debate, and your mind, that once private sanctuary, starts to feel like hostile territory. You remember something painful, the argument, the silence, the shift in energy. But they remember peace. They remember laughter. They remember you starting it. And now you're unsure. Did you overreact? Were you too sensitive? Is your pain just a story you told yourself? The more they insist, the more isolated you feel. Because they're not just denying the moment, they're denying you. And the self is built on memory. To question it is to unravel everything. There's a symbol here, a diary with pages rewritten by someone else. Your handwriting is still there, but the words have changed, the ink smudged, the lines rearranged. You know what you felt. But now even your own memories feel suspect. And in that confusion, trust breaks. Not just trust in them, but in your own mind. This is the silent damage of psychological manipulation. It leaves no bruises, no evidence, just a growing fog, a hesitation, a voice inside you that used to say, I know what happened, and now whispers, maybe I was wrong. And here's the cruel paradox. You remember pain. They remember peace. Both versions can't be true. And yet both feel real. This discrepancy creates emotional vertigo, a kind of memory whiplash, where each attempt to anchor yourself only deepens the spin. The harder you try to prove what you recall, the more defensive you sound. And slowly you learn to stay quiet, to retreat into doubt, to let them narrate your life for you. But the body remembers. Even when the mind is blurred by suggestion, your nervous system holds the imprint. The way your stomach dropped when the door closed. The way your hands trembled after a conversation. The way your heart raced when their tone shifted. These are memories too, not in words, but in sensation, in pattern, in repetition. And so the question becomes, how do you trust your memory after someone has convinced you not to? How do you rebuild inner knowing when it's been slowly dismantled? The first step is to stop asking for permission, to stop seeking confirmation from the one who distorted you. Gaslighting only works when you keep handing over the authority to define reality. Reclaiming your memory means reclaiming your right to say, this is how it felt, whether or not they agree. The second step is gentler. It means honoring the places in your memory where the facts are unclear but the feeling isn't. You may not remember every word that was said, but you remember the shame, the fear, the dread. That's valid, that's yours, that's evidence too. Jung might say, this is the confrontation with the shadow Not just the shadow in others, but in yourself. The part of you that internalized their voice, that learned to second guess, that learned survival by silence. Bringing that part into the light is not easy. It means grieving the moments you surrendered your truth, but it also means reclaiming them slowly, softly, one memory at a time. And here's where healing begins, when you stop needing the other person to admit it. When you stop hoping they'll say, "You were right," when you realize the most powerful voice in your life doesn't belong to them, it belongs to you. You may never get the apology, you may never get the clarity, but you can get yourself back. You can look at the rewritten diary and say, "This page was mine, I remember what it said. I don't need you to validate it." And that is not delusion, that is resurrection. So if you're standing in that fog, if your memory feels like a war zone, breathe. You are not broken, you are not imagining things. You were simply taught to abandon your knowing, and now you're remembering how to remember again. The brain never stops dreaming, even when you're awake. Even as you move through daily routines, conversations, decisions, the dreaming mind continues beneath the surface, stitching together fragments, sensations, impressions into a soft hum of narrative. We think of dreams as confined to the night, images behind closed eyes, ephemeral, untrue. But what if the dreaming mind never turns off? What if memory itself is a dream, one we agree upon long enough to call it real? In many ways, it is. Neuroscience tells us that memory isn't stored like a file on a shelf. It's reconstructed each time we recall it, built anew from scattered neurons, then tucked away again, changed slightly by the very act of remembering. Just like a dream, changes each time we retell it. Memory isn't a playback. It's a rendering, a performance of what we think we once felt, seen through the lens of who we are today. The self becomes a kind of dreamscape, vivid, meaningful, but never fully stable. And this makes sense in a way. Because the brain's job isn't to preserve truth. Its job is to keep you coherent, to tell a story you can survive in. So it dreams you into shape. Gives you a version of the past that explains your present. Sometimes that version is accurate, sometimes it's generous, sometimes it's cruel, but it's always built to keep the system running, even if it means constructing memories that never happened, or deleting the ones that did. Imagine your life not as a line, but as a quilt. Squares stitched together from real moments, imagined ones, misremembered ones. Some squares are bright, others dark. Some are frayed from too much handling. Some are new, artificial patches added just to cover the holes. It's not a perfect record. It's a dream tapestry. And yet when you hold it, you say, "This is me." That's the illusion we live inside. That memory is truth. That it holds up our identity. But in reality, memory is more like fog. A waking hallucination the brain generates to anchor you in time. You trust it because you have to. You trust it because the alternative that none of it is fixed is terrifying. And yet maybe it's also freeing. If the brain is a dreaming machine, then your past is not set in stone. It's soft, shapeable, not in the sense that you can rewrite history, but in the sense that you can reinterpret it, that you can change the meaning, that you are not trapped in the version of events that once defined you. The dream can evolve, the story can change. Jung believed the unconscious speaks in symbols, in myth, in dream logic. He saw the psyche not as a machine of logic, but as a living narrative, one that loops, spirals, revisits themes in different disguises. And if that's true, then memory is just one more symbol, a scene in the larger dream of who you're becoming. Not static, not objective, just a doorway into deeper awareness. Sometimes the dream fractures. You remember something so vividly and then someone shows you evidence it didn't happen. The photo is missing. The text was never sent. The conversation left no trace. And in that moment, your dream mind collides with the outer world. It's jarring, like waking up and not recognizing the room you're in. But maybe the point isn't to choose between the dream and the waking world. Maybe the point is to recognize that both hold truth, just different kinds. There's a symbol here, a quilt stitched from old dreams and new facts. Some patches are sewn with golden thread memories that comfort. Others are stitched hastily out of fear or shame. You wrap yourself in it anyway, because it's yours, because it kept you warm, because no matter how surreal, it's the story you lived through. This is not to say that memory is meaningless, only that it's alive, that it breathes, that it's allowed to evolve, just like you. So what does this mean for healing? For self-understanding? It means that instead of demanding perfect recall, you can listen to the symbols in your memory, to what keeps recurring, to what still stings, to what still comforts. It means that every time you revisit a painful moment, you can ask, what was this dream trying to teach me? What part of me was longing for something here? Because the dreaming brain is not just confused, it's intelligent. It doesn't fabricate at random. It builds narratives around emotional truths. If a memory appears that never happened, it still points to something real. A need, a fracture, a hunger. And when you trace it back, not to the fact, but to the feeling, you find something important. And maybe that's the beginning of a new kind of memory. One that doesn't need to be exact, but honest. One that doesn't ask, did it happen? But what did it mean? One that allows the dream to keep unfolding without demanding it freeze into certainty. So you close your eyes, and you see your timeline again, not as a straight road, but as a swirling spiral. Threads of truth, threads of story, threads of dream, woven not just to tell you who you were, but to whisper who you might still become. There are moments in life that feel like cracks in the film of reality, sudden quiet shifts that make you question whether the world has always been this way. You notice a detail out of place, a word spelled differently, a memory that no longer aligns with consensus. And instead of brushing it off, something inside you pauses, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the universe just leaned a little closer and whispered, this isn't the only version. This is the spiritual undertone of the Mandela Effect. Beyond psychology, beyond neuroscience, it carries the scent of something metaphysical. A question, hidden inside a glitch. What if reality isn't fixed? What if timelines weave together, like strands of thread occasionally slipping out of sync? What if your memory is not wrong, but from somewhere else entirely? Some interpret the Mandela Effect as evidence of parallel universes, timelines that diverged quietly, subtly, without announcement. In one version of reality, Mandela died in prison. In another, he lived. You remember Berenstain because that's the world you came from. You recall Luke, I am your father, because that's how the scene played out in a nearby strand of existence. But now you've shifted, not violently, not catastrophically, just enough to notice the seams. It sounds fantastical, but so does dreaming. So does consciousness itself. And perhaps that's the point. We live in mystery, dressed in predictability. We walk through patterns, but underneath everything hums with possibility. There's a symbol here, a spiral staircase suspended in space. No railings, no beginning, no end. Just steps that loop upward, downward, sideways, depending on where you stand. That's how the soul might move through time. Not in straight lines, but in spirals. And sometimes you wake up on a different step than where you fell asleep. This symbolic interpretation isn't about proving multiverse theory. It's about acknowledging that you are more than your timeline, that your memory may be carrying echoes of who you've been across dimensions, psychic, emotional, ancestral. Maybe your soul has walked other versions of this life. Maybe those versions left shadows, or imprints, or whispers. And when they rise, when you remember something that never happened here, you're not malfunctioning. You're remembering across layers. Carl Jung might call this the collective unconscious, a realm where symbols, archetypes, and patterns repeat across space and time. In that space, memory is less about fact and more about resonance. You remember what fits a pattern. You remember what completes a symbol. So when the symbol changes, when Berenstain becomes Berenstain, the disruption isn't just linguistic, it's psychic. A signpost has shifted, and you who once walked confidently now wonder where the map changed. But perhaps the Mandela Effect is also a mirror, not showing you a different reality, but reflecting your longing for one. A yearning for a universe where things turned out differently, where the friend didn't leave, where the world was gentler, where your life branched in a more beautiful direction. The false memory becomes a symbol of the possible, the road not taken, but still imagined. And in that imagination, there is power. Because if one version of reality can shift, then perhaps others can too. Not just in memory, but in choice, in action. If the past isn't as solid as we thought, maybe the future isn't as fixed either. Maybe every moment contains a doorway. Maybe every belief holds a key. Spiritual traditions have always whispered this. that the world you see is not all there is, that consciousness creates reality, that what you hold in mind shapes what you experience. The Mandela Effect then becomes more than a quirk. It becomes a parable, a waking dream that invites you to soften your grip on what you thought was unchangeable. And maybe that's what unsettles us most, not the glitch itself, but what it reveals, that nothing is entirely stable. That truth, even shared truth, is more fluid than we want it to be. That the world can rearrange itself in silence, and we might never notice, unless we pay attention. So you start to wonder, have I lived this moment before? Was I meant to choose differently? Is this life the only one I've walked? Or just the one I remember best? And in asking, something softens. Not in fear, but in wonder. Because if reality is dreamlike, then your choices matter more, not less. Your thoughts carry weight, your attention creates gravity, and your memories, even the strange, misplaced ones, might be doorways, not dead ends. You picture the spiral again, floating, turning, each memory a step, each shift a nudge from some deeper intelligence. Not punishing you for remembering wrong, but inviting you to remember more. To expand what you believe is possible, to walk a little slower through the dream. So the next time you experience a Mandela Effect, a moment that feels out of phase, out of sync, maybe you don't dismiss it. Maybe you pause, breathe, ask, what is this trying to show me? Not as a riddle to solve, but as a symbol to sit with. Because sometimes the cracks in the story aren't mistakes, they're openings. And through them you might glimpse not just another version of reality, but a deeper version of yourself. We want things to make sense, that desire, quiet, persistent pulses beneath everything. We want the story to fit, the past to explain the present, the choices to align with meaning. That's the architecture of coherence. A house built on cause and effect, on memory and logic, on the idea that there is a reason for everything. It's not just a mental preference, it's a survival instinct. Because when the narrative falls apart, the self begins to drift. You feel this when a memory doesn't match the facts. When the ending of a relationship doesn't make emotional sense. When your version of events doesn't align with someone else's. The confusion isn't just cognitive, it's existential. Because coherence isn't about details. It's about identity, about continuity, about waking up each day and being able to say, I know who I am, because I remember how I got here. But what happens when the story breaks? What happens when the past rewrites itself, when a beloved memory turns out to be borrowed, embellished, even fabricated? Or when you realize that the narrative you've lived inside about your family, your country, yourself, was more myth than truth? There's grief in that. A subtle, aching grief. Because coherence was never about being correct. It was about feeling safe. There's a symbol here, a book with missing chapters, its pages scattered across a floor. You try to piece them together. You try to make sense, but some parts are gone. Others contradict. Some seem to belong to a different story entirely. And still, you try. Because the alternative, living without narrative, feels unbearable. But here's the hidden cost. Sometimes, in our desperation for coherence, we believe in fictions. We tell ourselves stories that hurt less, that give order to chaos. We turn betrayals into lessons, wounds, into character arcs, absences into destiny. Not because it's wrong to do so, but because coherence offers relief. You may have told yourself, I'm this way because of what happened. And maybe that's true. But maybe it's also a simplification, a soft avoidance of something more complex. Because life isn't always a clean arc. Sometimes it's spiral-shaped. Sometimes it's fragmented. Sometimes it resists coherence altogether. And that's what makes false memories so seductive. They give the illusion of continuity, they complete the pattern, they fill in the gaps with something that sounds like meaning, even if it didn't happen, even if it's not real. You may remember someone loving you consistently. You may remember yourself as always the one who stayed. You may recall a decision as inevitable a loss as foreseen. And maybe those memories help the story feel complete. But what if that completion came at the cost of truth? What if the memory smooths over what was too painful to hold? This isn't wrong. It's human. The mind is a coherence machine. It's not interested in randomness. It needs patterns. It needs narrative. It needs to believe that this moment, this version of you, is explainable. And when memory doesn't cooperate, the mind will improvise. But maybe the most courageous thing you can do is allow some incoherence, to sit with the places where the story doesn't make sense, where the memory isn't reliable, where the meaning hasn't arrived yet, to stop forcing closure and instead to hold space for mystery, because coherence can become a cage. When we cling to it too tightly, we start rejecting any truth that doesn't fit the plot. We ignore evidence. We silence discomfort. We rewrite the past to protect the present. And in doing so, we lose access to the deeper, messier truths that want to emerge. So you ask yourself, would I rather know the truth or believe a beautiful lie? And maybe the answer isn't either or. Maybe the truth is not always beautiful, but the act of facing it, of allowing incoherence, is. Jung said that wholeness is not about perfection, but integration. It's about holding the contradictions, the truths and the falsehoods, the clarity and the confusion, and trusting that yourself is spacious enough for all of it. You don't have to have a clean timeline. You don't have to remember everything correctly. You don't have to explain every decision. You are allowed to be a mystery even to yourself. So when the memories shift, when the story bends, when coherence fades, pause. Don't rush to fix it. Let the silence speak. Let the scattered pages remain unbound. Not forever, just long enough to ask, what have I been avoiding by trying to make sense too quickly? Because sometimes what looks like incoherence is actually emergence, a new story trying to form, one that doesn't rely on clean arcs or perfect memory, one that is deeper, stranger, truer. You close the book, not because it's finished, but because for now it's enough to know I'm not broken. I'm in between stories, and maybe that's where the real self begins to speak. Some memories must be let go, not because they were bad, but because they were never truly yours. They may have comforted you, protected you, even given you purpose, but eventually you begin to feel the subtle friction, a quiet misalignment between the story you've been telling and the self that no longer fits inside it. And when that happens, letting go is not an act of rejection. It's an act of reverence. You're not discarding the memory. You're releasing the role it once played. False memories aren't always illusions. They are often mirrors, reflections of what the psyche needed at a specific time. A story that held you in the aftermath of chaos. A softened version of a painful moment. A belief that made you feel stronger than you were. And now with distance, with growth, with softness, you begin to notice the memory wasn't accurate, but it was meaningful. Letting go doesn't mean erasing. It means holding the memory with open hands. It means saying, thank you for what you gave me, even if you weren't real in the way I thought. You acknowledge the version of yourself who needed it, who dreamed it, who kept it alive, not to deceive, but to survive. There's a symbol here, a photograph slowly dissolving into mist, the image fading not from neglect, but from release. You no longer cling to it. You let it return to the ether. Not out of bitterness, but because you're ready to remember something else now. Something truer, even if it's messier, even if it hurts more before it heals. This is where the work becomes quiet. No dramatic goodbye, no erasing the past, just a soft internal shift, the way a wound closes, not with a bang, but with breath. You might visit the memory one more time. Notice the details, the way the light fell, the words spoken, and then gently you allow the recognition. Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe it was a dream. And maybe that's okay. In healing, we often talk about integration. It doesn't mean adopting every story as fact. It means understanding why the story was there in the first place. It means looking beneath the details and asking, what was this memory trying to give me? And then asking with kindness, is there another way I can receive that now? Perhaps you imagined being protected when you weren't. Perhaps you believed you were at fault when you weren't. Perhaps you held on to a version of a person or yourself that made the world make sense even if it wasn't quite real. And when those illusions fall away, grief arises. Grief not just for what didn't happen, but for how long you carried it. But beneath that grief, there is also light. Because in releasing the false, you make space for the unknown, for new stories, for memories that haven't yet been formed. And this time, they don't need to be perfect. They don't need to make sense. They just need to be honest. So you sit with the fading memory, not in judgment but in love. You thank it for the protection, for the lesson, for the comfort, and then softly you say, "You can rest now. I no longer need you to be true." This is not forgetting. This is transformation. Because even a false memory can point you toward a deeper truth. The truth of your resilience. The truth of your longing. The truth of a self that has always been trying in every dream, every glitch, every misplaced memory to become whole. And now you're listening. Maybe the memory wasn't real. Maybe it never happened. Not the way you remember it. Not at all. And yet, it shaped you. It left its mark. It taught you something about safety or sorrow or the ache of longing, and in that way it mattered. In that way it was true not as a fact, but as a fragment of meaning your mind held close when the world felt too uncertain. Memory is not a photograph. It's not a courtroom transcript. It's a dream, a language the soul uses to speak to itself. Some of it is fog. Some of it is fire. Some of it impossibly feels like both. And maybe the point isn't to sort real from false accurate from imagined. Maybe the point is simply to listen, to hold each memory with curiosity rather than fear. To wonder not what happened, but what it meant. To remember not just the events, but the symbols, the shadows, the silences. You are not your memories. You are the awareness that holds them, the quiet observer who watches them flicker and fade, rise and return, and even when they contradict, even when the stories change, you remain. So tonight, as your mind drifts, let the memories soften. Let the need for perfect clarity dissolve. You are not broken, you are not lost, you are simply human stitched together by stories, by symbols, by dreams. And that is more than enough. End of script. Drift gently and I'll meet you in the next thought.